Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Harper Podcast. I'm really excited to be in conversation today with Romulus Whitaker and Janaki Lenin. Rom and Janaki, thank you so much for joining us today to talk a little bit about this incredible book, Snakes, Drugs, and Rock and Roll. Rom, these are about your early years, and you've definitely not left out. It sounds like you haven't left out much because it's a really fascinating read. It's been a wild ride, I would say. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, well, greetings, everybody. We worked on this for about 5 years. So it was quite a labor, but in fact, a very exciting labor in a way, because looking back over the years in anyone's life can be exciting. And the more you think about it, the more it comes back. It's just amazing what your brain holds on to, but it doesn't sort of emerge until you get some sort of stimulus, like Janaki poking in my eye and saying, "Don't you remember that?"
And Janaki, I mean, we're talking about the 50s, 60s, essentially the first 25 years of a very unconventional life. And of course, Rom, many people know as the snake man of India. He's the wildlife conservationist. But there are definitely stories here from the start of that journey, and it may not be what people expect.
Yeah, I think that was one of our worries about this book, that people might not recognize the Rom that they know in the book, and that it's all his formative years. But we thought it would be interesting to look at how diverse his background has been. He's like tried all these other professions and kept coming back to snakes, and how he learned his job. So we thought there was value in that. And it's also interesting because it's a time when snakes were not considered an animal. They were more like vermin, you know. We're basically looking at this world through the perspective of a very marginalized uh, class of animals. It's only now that it's very macho and brave and charismatic to be handling snakes or working with snakes. And then, at that time, nobody was, or very few people were. It wasn't mainstream at all.
Hmm. So, Ron, can I ask you a little bit about that? Of course, if anyone Googles you right now, we know you founded a snake park, the Madras Crocodile Bank. You're a filmmaker. You're well known as a conservationist. But can we come to where that journey started? In terms of how you document in the book as well, snakes always had a peculiar fascination for you. And you talk, about your time at Juhu. You talk about even boarding school where you had a pet python. So anything you'd like to share with with folks who might not have gotten the book yet? Where did that journey really start? Where did that fascination really grow out of?
I think I've always maintained that kids in general are fascinated by creepy crawlies. I mean, as a little kid, you're on the ground, for example, and on the ground are ants and beetles and little bugs and stuff crawling around. And, that's your first fascination. Unfortunately, mommy or daddy will go whack, or stomp on it or something, and don't touch that, don't go near it. So most kids don't ever get past that into the larger creepy crawlies like snakes. Well, I had a weird mother. She was a wonderful but weird mother. So when I'd bring something back for her to see, whether it was a praying mantis or a grasshopper or eventually a snake, she would say, "Wow, how interesting! Oh, let's look at it. Here's a magnifying glass. Look at its eyes and stuff like that." Now, which mother? Where do you find a mother like that these days? But
Yeah.
man, that just opened my eyes and opened my heart, so to speak, to getting closer to these creatures and to sticking with it. And I think that's how I really started out.
And it's fascinating because you had this sort of like side hustle, we would call it now. I think as a child, because like you said, a lot of people when they see these creepy crawlies in their apartments or their houses. So when you're talking about Mumbai, you're talking about Juhu and Bombay back in the day. You're the kid folks would call to help with the lizards and the spiders and whatnot.
Yeah, definitely. And I was excited, and it probably fed my ego too. That I could be called to rescue some damsel in distress, so to speak. And here I was 5 or 6 or 8 years old or something like that, and going in to catch a gecko, which was terrorizing the family. I mean, it, like I said, it probably just made me feel, wow, what a hero I am. Got that gecko out of their house, and now they feel, and then they'd give me a brownie or a cookie or something for it as a prize. So yeah, it was well worth it.
And when did you notice? I mean, is it sometime around when you're in in boarding school? You talk actually a little bit. This it's very moving actually. You talk about some of the experiences as a child that actually aren't great for you. You talk about the finding your friends and finding your passion. You're going off on fishing expeditions. You're realizing how much you enjoy being in the sort of in the wild, in nature. When would you notice, for example, that everyone doesn't have this affinity for your favorite species or animals, for example? And I'd love to ask you a little bit more about how that pet python ends up under your bed in boarding school. But when did you first realize maybe other kids have different interests? You don't have that
Well,
many.
I think I was probably missing that in a way, missing that I would have friends who would sort of join me and stuff. So in a way, I became quite a loner for quite a period of time there, and there were just a couple of friends who I, in fact, refer to in the book, who I got along with and who sort of joined me in my pursuits and passions. But in a way, it was lucky because that got me out of that school environment into the local environment. And I started meeting the people, the fishermen, the tribal people, the people who walked in the forest, the hunters. And, from a very early time onwards, I got to know them. And that's how I learned the local language. I learned Tamil at that time. That was such a breakthrough, too, because being a little white kid in the top of a mountain in South India, it's one thing when you're in school, you're part of the gang, but to get out of that gang was a very exciting thing for me and a very formative time for me to get out there and meet people and work and fish with them or hunt with them. So that was a really good start in what eventually became my career.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, and Janaki, I'd love to ask you as well. I feel that there's also this moment where you realize it's sort of like a coming of age. These adults are taking this kid very seriously because they see how passionate he is, and it's kind of Rom writes about really almost proving himself each time. That first encounter where initially they're just like, oh, this is just another spoiled kid from a boarding school, but they realize and his passion comes through. What are some of the anecdotes that stood out for you, Janaki, when you were working on this book? What are some of the anecdotes that you want to share?
I think everything about it. I mean, I just cannot believe the adults in his life were so allowed him to have an air rifle in his boarding school, in his dorm. And then when the principal says, okay, hereafter no kid is going to have a firearm, there is a teacher who lobbies for him to have his air rifle in the dorm. I mean, and it goes on. I mean, it's that's probably the most extreme, but there is the idea of his mother letting him at 4 years old range around the countryside, go through electric fences to the stream. God knows what he is up to, and she is off in her workshop doing her thing. I mean, now we don't even allow children a pair of scissors because they
Yeah,
might cut themselves. And or they have special scissors that only cuts paper and can't hurt them. And here is this kid playing with all kinds of what we would call dangerous things that would be banned from the kids section of the supermarket or a toy shop or whatever. So he's
yeah,
out fishing with, hooks and stuff that could, the hooks have barbs. So if he were to accidentally poke himself, that could be dangerous. He does get pierced by a hook, but that's a little bit later in life. But he could very easily have had that happen when he was 4 or 5 years old. It's like the universe just seemed to smile on this boy. Like everything conspired to let him follow his passion, not only
yeah.
with It's with the fishing, with the hunting, and I mean, there is this guy who loans him a shotgun.
Yeah, that's true.
I
I can't
mean, so how? I mean, I just cannot imagine a time or an era that this can happen, and it
Yeah.
just astonishes me that Rom got away with all these things when he was young,
And
and that
survive.
and he
survive.
didn't have to be in class. He doesn't have to, get good grades, and his credits are lacking. So there is this vice principal who conspires to push him out of school to graduate with enough credits. I mean, how do you line up these set of adults to get you
Yeah.
through your childhood?
Well, he was just trying to get rid of me. I mean, obviously.
Well, I thought about it, but they failed another chap, right? They failed Chris.
That's true too.
They could have easily held you back.
You
I
do
could
talk
still
about
I could still be there.
if they'd want. You do go back and give a sort of address to the school many years later, as you say. But I wanna pick, discuss a couple of things you say there. So you do write in the book about the god of, I don't think you say idiots, but you're like God watching over like certainly mischief makers, and how you keep stumbling into things, and there's a lot of luck. But you also have this really grueling episode where you're actually at a military boarding school. It's a military school. It's not
Yeah.
a experience, and that's something I'd love to ask you a little bit more about.
Oh boy, let's not talk about that. I mean, yeah. Well, from the very start, I was always adverse to any sort of regimentation of any kind. And here I am popped into a school which was utter regimentation from the word go. And wearing a uniform every day to class and to school, I mean, come on. Polishing your shoes and doing all this nonsense to make yourself look like everybody else. And, and that too really bugged me, Everyone's got to look exactly like the other. And, man, I mean, just thinking about it puts me back in that horrible sort of feeling of having to be in a regimentated sort of society. Oh, how awful.
It sounded very traumatic, but you did leave, and then I think your mother was happy to bring you out of there when she realized that you weren't sort of thriving, or did that take some convincing?
Well, it was actually the arrival of my step grandfather Harindranath when he came there, and it was such a marvelous experience for all the children to see this wonderful humorous poet come up there, and we all sang some of Tagore's songs when he was there, and it was just great. And of course I was feeling great because he was my grandfather. And but I definitely, I don't remember this, but obviously I cried and had confessed to him that I'm really having a miserable time. And that was the point at which I was taken out of the school. You see, when we wrote back to our parents, the letters were quite carefully censored, and we didn't say anything negative in the letters about how they beat the hell out of me yesterday or something like that. So, yeah, it had to come through an experience like this. And again, like Janaki said, I was just lucky in so many ways, and lucky that my grandfather did come at that point in time and dragged me out of there. So, yeah, it all worked out in the end, but it was pretty traumatic.
But there were probably 300 other kids that went through that school.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And from what Janaki was saying as well, it does really come across as a different era. Like there's so many things you get to do, which of course have made you who you are today. But I do want to ask you a little bit about fear, because it doesn't sound like you're scared in the way you've written the book as well. It doesn't sound like you're scared when you're going out into the wild. It doesn't sound like you're scared when you're popped into these very different environments. But for a child, or even actually when you go back to the US, when you're trying to figure out college on your own, when you join the Merchant Navy, as you document these different chapters in your life, you're not really sure what's coming next. And it does come across that you have a safety net. Yes, like you said, an unconventional family. They're more than happy to let you do what you want. But at the same time, there's all this freedom to do anything. And it sounds like that could also be a bit challenging. But I do want to ask you if you at any point felt, scared or worried or alone or just wondering what's going to happen next.
I think the only thing that I was scared of was people and society. I think everything else was, I would sort of gravitate toward getting out there and being alone. And I felt wonderful being alone. Anywhere in the wild, as far as I was concerned, was great. I mean, even if there was a tiger or an elephant or whatever out there, or in the case of in the States, it was bears and stuff like that. I was fascinated by them. Whereas I was quite a misfit when it came to society. I didn't join a fraternity in college, for example. I didn't go to those big parties and stuff. I don't know. I just didn't feel comfortable. So it was more a fear of society and people than a fear of the wilds or anything unknown like that. I think that's how I've sort of been all my life. Really.
And do you think that, I mean, is it something that, I love how Janaki and you both actually, when I read something like this, I just feel like it's actually quite incredible for any other kids who might be reading this, maybe not the drugs bit, and you do say in the end don't do drugs, so that's the PSA, but it's pretty inspiring to see someone sort of unconventional, not wanting to conform, and charting their own path. Would you agree with me? I mean, is that a little simplistic? But I just feel like there's something so freeing and liberating about how you've told the story, how you've chosen to not gloss over certain chapters as well. Maybe Janaki first and then Ram. Do you think it's something that would inspire, especially I think other kids who maybe don't fit in exactly where they are, but have a passion for something that's not as conventional?
Well, that wasn't, we weren't thinking of that when we were writing the book. I think we were very aware that it could be a very self-indulgent exercise to write about oneself. And I think we were trying constantly to keep it real, to look at both sides. Okay, so all these good things happened, but what were the bad things, or what were the things that builds character, as Charlie Brown would put it, for in a challenging situation. So that phase, I mean, 8-9 months in that military school was part of that whole exercise. It was like it sowed the seeds of Rom's fear of regimentation, of violence, of treating other people as badly. So all those are themes that recur in life later on when he has to join. He's drafted into the army, so it's going back, reliving those military school memories, but now he's an adult and much better able to deal with the situation. And in fact, that surprised me, because I had thought, after hearing the stories of his school, that he would fare very badly in the military. But after the first few months, he just gets into the groove of it, and he starts enjoying it, if I might say so, even though Rom doesn't seem to agree. But if you read those sections, he really is reveling in the language of the sergeant, and how they teach him to throw grenades and fire at little straw-filled mannequins and things like that. So he does surmount those difficulties, and I think that also builds his character.
Yeah. Ram, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree, definitely. I think I don't think we mentioned it maybe in the book, but there were 2 or 3 of us sort of pals in the army together and during that basic training period, which is what we're referring to now. That's when the sergeants and all get really heavy on you. And we considered ourselves philosophers. And we would talk back and forth, and we would start saying, these guys, they're doing what they're doing, basically, so that when we get sent over to Vietnam and they say duck, or dive or hit the ground, you better bloody well do it or you're going to get shot or blown up or something. So we started nodding and saying, yeah, well, I guess there's a lesson in this, but we can survive this because this is what they're trying to do to us. So I think, by being philosophical about your trials and tribulations, it helps you pull through. And this is what we're doing, sort of saving each other by talking about it.
So did the army not break your will?
Not really, no. There are people, there were kids who were with me who they really broke their will, and there were kids who were crying at night in the barracks and just crying for their mothers and stuff like that. And we sort of laughed at them, and we were pretty cruel. But yeah, I think I got through it okay. I'd already been through it as a kid, and like you said, maybe I was prepared for this sort of pretty miserable experience. And it just took a few weeks for me and my philosophical friends to get over it, the hard part of it, really.
I do want to also come back to this chapter on, it's not a chapter actually, in the journey, and you write about why you wanted to be so honest. I think somewhere you say there's no point doing a biography. You're not going to be honest even about, bits that you might not be comfortable with, or you might not, fans of yours who know you, as we were starting off to say, this episode to say, who know you as the snake man of India, who know you as a conservationist. You've had your start though more in the sort of hunting space. Can you take us through a little bit of, it's of course a different era. Can you take us through a little bit of that? Because as a child, that was also a huge passion for you.
Yeah, from very early on, when I first started to read, I was reading Jim Corbett and other hunting books, John Hunter from Africa, African books, and about hunting, and I really got into it. And when I was stalking around after a dove or a sparrow with my air gun, man, I wasn't after a dove or a sparrow. I was after a rhino or a tiger or something like that. And this wasn't an air gun. This was a 450 Magnum, something huge. So I was really in this sort of fantasy land as a hunter. And it was interesting. I sort of perhaps cheating a little bit, because when I was killing these birds, I wasn't doing anything with them at the beginning. But gradually I got into this whole thing of skinning birds and, stuffing them and stuff like that. So now I grandly say, yes, I was being scientific now, even though I was killing them, I was saving the specimen and stuff like that. Man, forget it. I was a killer. And I think this was perhaps an intrinsic part of a person's nature. I was going to say a man's nature, but let's not get sexist here. It's something that is, I would say, almost natural and very tribal, very, very simplistic. Maybe I'm wrong, but I was really into hunting. I was really into stalking them and learning the habits of animals and birds, so I could get close to them, creep close enough to kill them. And I knew that a clean kill was a good kill, and I shouldn't wound an animal. This kind of stuff. This is all stuff that I had read in hunting books and discussed it with my friends. So, yeah, like you say, it was a different era for sure, because when I read some of my old classmates write to me recently and say, yeah, back when I was, they were all missionary kids, and they were living in places like Bastar district in Madhya Pradesh. And they went out hunting on their vacations virtually every single day. So we were all hunters as kids.
And when does that change? And when do you start feeling more sort of, this urge to sort of conserve, and the sort of conservation, but the protective instinct? You do document anecdotes where, for example, people are really scared when they see a snake, and you're kind of like, leave this one alone, it's harmless. You share a lot of that as well. When does this kind of mindset start to shift for you?
Well, that's an interesting point you just made, because I was wondering about that myself. When did I sort of start thinking about conservation? I guess I thought about it right from the beginning, because I loved snakes, and I didn't love the idea that people hated them and they kept killing them. So I was, the snake missionary from way, way back, from the time I was really little. I was probably pretty obnoxious about it because I would tell adults, try to teach adults about, how wonderful snakes are. And they say, what do you mean wonderful? They kill people. They're venomous. And I was saying, yeah, but very few, I'd go through the whole explanation of there are very few which are actually venomous. And they're not after you. That's your imagination. You step on it or try to kill it, and naturally it'll bite to protect itself. So in a way, my conservation started very, very early. And this is actually, this conversation we're having now is the first time I've sort of pinned down the fact that, yes, in fact, I did start out very, very early, but it was very targeted. As far as the hunting went, man, even all the way into my 20s when I was in Wyoming, so-called doing college, I was a hunter, and I felt this is the way you live. You go out, you don't go to the supermarket and buy meat. You go out and you shoot meat. And this is how you live, and it's wonderful being out in the mountains, stalking deer and getting the right shot. Killing the animal with one shot and not wounding it or something like that. So yeah, the conservation thing was very, very, very targeted to snakes early on, and it then later on. Well, we'll get into volume 2 later on and talk about when I did crocodile surveys, and then I saw that people had just hammered the hell out of crocodiles all over India. They were really on their way out. The gharial was down to 200. Well, let's not go too much into this because that's in book 2.
That's in book 2.
But that's when conservation really hit home and really grabbed me and made me want to do something.
And that's been like a lifelong mission since then. Since that.
Yeah, really, it has, for sure.
So I want to come back to some of the unconventional bits. So snakes were your jam, really. As a child, there's someone in Mumbai now, Bombay then, who it's a pet shop owner or an adult who gets you a snake from a pet shop and you get to keep it at home. That's a fascinating chapter. I can't imagine anyone listening to this would think that's a normal thing to happen. But can you tell us a little bit about that? And also you say at one point your mom's pet is in danger, though she never realized it. Tell us a little bit about that, and then having a python in boarding school.
Yeah, it was interesting because my mother's friend, her name was Io. She was a Danish lady, and we went to Crawford Market every week. And my mother would sit, and there was this. She'd go to a particular stall, a large stall in the middle of Crawford Market. It was a really boisterous market. I mean, we're talking about noisy people going back and forth, stuff all over the floors, baskets full of fruit coming in and going. And this particular shopkeeper that my mother went to was wonderful because she would say with her long list, I want this, I want that, and he'd pack it all up and get it ready. And while things were going on, I always went over to the animal market and looked at all the creatures that they had there, mostly livestock, but occasionally interesting animals like different kinds of turtles, sometimes a monitor lizard. And this day I told Io, why don't you come with me? I must have been, 12 or 13, I guess. And I said, let's go to the animal market. And she said, oh, yes, I'd love to go. And so we went there, and this guy who knew me by that time, because I'd been there so many times, said, I have something special you'd love to see. And he didn't think I was going to buy it, I guess, but he'd love to show it to me. And it was a python in a cage. And I said, wow, how beautiful, this fantastic python. I mean, they are a beautiful snake. And Io, this lady, was not frightened. She was very interested too. And he took it out using a gunny sack and stuff, and was very careful in case it bit him. It didn't bite. But I started handling it, and Io sort of touched it and said, what a beautiful snake. And this guy said, yes, 100 rupees. And she said, oh, 100 rupees here. And she started pulling the money out. And I said, and she said, well, wouldn't you like it? And I was thinking, oh God, what's my mother going to say, But of course I said yes. So that was very quick, the transaction of 100 rupees, and we didn't bargain or anything. And I got this python into the gunny sack. And then we went back to where my mother was sitting, and I told her, guess what? Yeah, and that's how the whole python saga started. Of course, and I know it was going through her mind. How the hell are we going to keep this in an apartment in Bombay? what are you going to do when you go to school? You're going to leave it with me to keep and feed. And how you won't be able to take it to school, obviously. So yeah, it started a big adventure that day.
And you also
Well,
had, yeah, go
yeah.
on.
No, luckily I ended up taking it to the school, and that's a whole other story, of course.
Yeah, and then you have like, I mean, it's another thing that seems, unimaginable, right now. But you have your school friends, your classmates all know about this python, and no one's kind of like ratting you out. Everyone's quite confident that you can take care of it, and it becomes a thing. I can't imagine that happening today.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, the ladies who swept the room, they were. I can't remember. I don't think they were in on it. As far as I was concerned, I told them just leave the box alone that's under the bed, and they didn't ask about it or think about it. So luckily it was there. And to take him out and sun himself, get the python into the sun, sometimes I had to make sure nobody was looking at that time, except a couple of my friends who knew about it. And, I'd be laying on the grass in the sun, and the python would be laying there basking next to me. And if someone was on the way, well, usually there was a bedspread on the ground where we were lying on it. So I just flipped the bedspread over the python, and people would walk by and say, hi. And they'd say, hi. And then after they went by, I just flipped the bedspread back again, and the sun, this python was sunning himself, enjoying life. Then of course, we had to set rat traps. I had to set rat traps and, get enough rats to feed him. But the cold weather in Kodaikanal was such that, a python can go without food for a month or 2 months or even 3 months without worrying about it too much. So it wasn't really that much of a hassle keeping him alive and healthy and happy.
But
Not
the more I think about it, I think people knew that you had a python. I just cannot believe it would have been very quiet for very long.
Well, again, looking at some of the letters people have sent me recently, they said, well, do you remember the baby python you had? And I was thinking, I didn't have a baby, but I did. Yes, I had a sand boa. And they thought it was a python because it looked quite a bit like a python. So actually, I had already kept snakes there. And so, I was the snake guy. And
already.
yeah, already. So you're
I
probably right. Yeah.
I feel like in when you had those like yearbooks and you write what you think your classmates are going to be. Yours would obviously have already been going on to be the snake guy for the country and world. I do want to ask you both a little bit about the writing of this, and then maybe Janaki first, and then Rom. Writing something like this, it's not the easiest mission because you have so much to pack in. It's about a quarter of a century, quite a while ago. How did you decide to do this? And it's the first of three. And what are some of the tips and tricks? What's the craft behind this? How did it work?
Well, we've been talking about doing this book for a long time. I, in fact, discovered notes from 10, 15 years ago that I had made. And so I'd take a stab at it, give it up, and we just started working seriously on it about 3, 4 years ago. The more I started pulling the stories apart and, carving off the sections, the chapters, I remember this conversation. I said to Ram, I don't see this book. There's going to be 3 books, and I don't think the first book is going to go beyond the age 25. And he says, oh my God, how are we going to do this? How can we sustain it? Can we sustain a whole book? And I showed him how the chapters stacked. And so we kind of, we are now committed to the 3 volumes. So that's how it just became so. The chapters, when Rom gave them to me, like his school chapters were like all compressed into one. So it was like one a compilation of his school years. And I started taking them apart. Okay, middle school and senior, and then a bit of elementary school. And then I started pulling those apart, and then they started becoming each chapter almost became a year of his
Hmm.
school year. So it became more and more elaborate as we went. So I think you've got to blame me for the saga that it's turned out into.
That's for
And
sure.
and Rom, does it make you nostalgic, or was it difficult to go through some of those memories? Was it fun? What was the journey like for you?
I think it was always fun. And I think what really bugged me is getting some of those particular things, some of those memories were sort of half there. The story was half done, but who was it who did this or did that, or how did you get that python to Kodaikanal? And what on a train with a python? I mean, there just all sorts of things had to come back, and luckily they did, which was it was just so important for Janaki to keep chavying me, keep bugging me about things, and getting some of those memories back. And it ended up we wrote to people, some of my old classmates, and they were wonderful to
Yeah.
say, yeah, we remember that. And some of them said some bizarre stuff which we didn't put into the book, but what? I don't believe that.
But I think the person we really missed while writing this book was Rom's mother.
Hmm.
Like
Oh
we,
yeah,
it was so frustrating that we wanted more details about this or that, and before she died, we would have just called her and asked her, and she would
yes,
have told us.
yeah,
And while we discovered while writing this book, we had a video recording of her talking.
Hmm.
We were asking her, I don't know why we did that. And we asked her that question then, what did you feel as a mother letting this little kid go off and hunt snakes? And she says, I had this conversation with my friend later on, like, how could I do this? And the friend said, how could you not? So it's
Hmm.
from that video clip that we had recorded of her, but we didn't do nearly enough video recording with her,
That's
or even audio recording, asking
right.
her what happened, when it happened. She was another person with an incredible memory right up to the end of her life. So it would have been a much richer book had she been alive, because we would have had access to her memories.
True,
yeah.
very true.
And I do want to ask you though. I mean, actually, what an incredible moment for your mother, Ram, to see you grow into the snake man of India, the kind of award-winning conservationist. Because, as you say, it was very unconventional, and how many moms would have let you and found it fascinating, when you would bring these sort of specimens back to her as well. Can you tell us a little bit about, her reaction when you became this renowned sort of conservationist as well?
There are some amusing bits. We made this film called King Cobra, Janaki and I, back in the late 90s. And my mother was very excited to hear that we had gotten an Emmy Award. And I said, Emmy, what's that? And she said, you've got to go for this. And I got this telegram from the Emmy people in New York City saying, yes, and please bring a tuxedo and all this kind of stuff. And I said, what are they talking about? Go to New York, wear a tuxedo, get an Emmy. I mean, what's the deal? And my mother really got pissed off. She said, what? You didn't go? I said, no, they mailed it to me. So,
No, but that also became a point of pride. My son didn't go to the Emmy Awards because they wanted him to wear a tuxedo. No, I think she always called him a nature boy. There is a little song in the book as well that she sang, and she called him that. And she used to say that he had a star in his hand and butterflies would sit on him. So she had her own mythology of how Rom was as he grew up.
very true.
That's lovely. That's lovely. So as we maybe wind down this episode, I'd love to ask you both maybe, what's coming down the pike, what you can share with us on book 2 and 3, and also, folks who inspire you. You've seen, both of you have also seen so much change. There's not a lot of hope always when we talk about this sort of ecological damage and what's going on, but maybe people who inspire you, writers or other folks in the movement.
You go first.
How, how should I go for it? Um,
Okay, I can tell you how the books stack up. So the second book starts off with him setting up the Bombay Snake Park, which then becomes the Madras Snake Park. And then he starts doing these surveys and realizing that more needs to be done for crocodiles. So he sets up the crocodile bank, and then he becomes a consultant for the United Nations, and they send him to do crocodile work to Papua New Guinea, to Mozambique, to West Papua, to Bangladesh. So there's a lot of adventures in all these different countries. And then it ends with Rom losing the snake park. And the third book begins sort of at that point where his career as a filmmaker takes off. So that's more the filmmaking. The third book is the filmmaking part, mostly. So that's roughly how what to expect with the coming books.
Okay. And Rom, any writers, thinkers, folks who inspire you? Anything you're reading or you'd want people to know about?
that's a tough one to answer. I have to put my
Rom,
thinking cap.
Rom reads sci-fi, dystopian novels. As if the world wasn't bad enough, he has to read about some imaginary awful world.
Not so much awful. Sometimes it's very exciting. Um, yeah, I was very impressed early on. I didn't always just read science fiction. I read serious stuff too. And George Schaller, for example, I mean, he is just such an icon. This man, working with gorillas, working with tigers. He wrote a book called The Deer and the Tiger about his time in Madhya Pradesh, studying tigers, and it sort of influenced me to the degree that I've got to write a book about the cobra and the rat, because it's in a way a very similar sort of scenario. We're talking about, an animal, the cobra, which is so iconic in India. I mean, it almost epitomizes India. In all the temples, there are carved cobras, and cobras are, all the snake charmers, the whole works. But at the same time, it's the snake which eats all the rats in the farmers' rice fields, and so it plays such a huge role, a huge part of Indian life, and we don't know much about it. So it's kind of up to me someday to write that book.
That'd be
And
awesome.
yeah, so it's people like Schaller and some of the other great conservationist
David
writers.
Quammen.
David Quammen too. Yeah, he's not a conservationist himself, but he writes about them,
Yeah.
and he has influenced me a lot as well. So yeah, the old days I was reading Hemingway and Steinbeck and all the sort of famous American authors, and all the African hunters and the Indian hunters, Kenneth Anderson and Jim Corbett. So and then in more recent years, and then as I evolved too, as into conservation, I started getting into the more scientific stuff. And people even call me a scientist. I don't know where they get that from, but yeah. So I've written lots and lots of papers with, fancy jargon and stuff, which I don't understand half of. But and what's really amazing is as I get older these days, people add me as a co-author on some real highfalutin scientific stuff, and I just say, look, people are going to ask me really embarrassing questions about this because now I'm a co-author on your fancy paper. Please leave me alone. Leave me alone. Yeah.
That is funny. Okay, I don't know about the fancy papers, but this book has been an incredible read. It's been amazing to be, to get a sort of bird's eye view of your life, the early years. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for writing the book, and we're certainly looking forward to the next two. So you have your work cut out for you. Thanks so
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you for having us. It was
Wonderful
a really
talking.
nice conversation. Yeah.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Thank you, and we will be in touch when this goes up. Thanks so much.
Wonderful.
I'll just,
Thank
yeah.
you. Bye bye.